Hi, I'm Dr. Sahni presenting to you another episode of Jib's Infotainment. Today we will be discussing about compliance and associated psychological factors. So what is compliance? Compliance is the tendency to agree to do what is requested, especially if there are certain factors present. A feeling that there is give and take, believability, likability, limited supply and positive feedback from others. Robert Cialdini studied how successful marketing results in consumer compliance. For example, soft drinks labels have long used celebrities to increase compliance. The ordinary consumer would buy the drink because they liked the celebrity, assumed that the celebrity approved of the product and believed what he had to say about it. Compliance is when an individual changes his or her behavior in response to an explicit or implicit request made by another person. Compliance is often referred to as an active form of social influence in that it is usually intentionally initiated by a person. It is also conceptualized as an external form of social influence in that its focus is a change in overt behavior. Although compliance may sometimes occur as a result of changes in people's internal beliefs and or feelings. Such internal changes are not the primary goal of compliance, nor are they necessarily required for the request to be successful. The foot in the door technique is a compliance tactic that assumes agreeing to a small request increases the likelihood of agreeing to a second, larger request. So initially, you make a small request, and once the person agrees to this, they find it more difficult to refuse a bigger one. For example, imagine one of your friends missed the last psychology class and asked to borrow your notes. This is a small request that seems reasonable. So you lend the notes to your friend. A week later, the same friend asks to borrow all of your psychology notes. This is a large request. Would you agree or not? The foot in the door technique works on the principle of consistency. People prefer not to contradict themselves in the both actions and beliefs. This means that as long as the request is consistent with or similar in nature to the original small request, the technique will work. The door in the face technique. This technique is a compliance method whereby the persuader attempts to convince the respondent to comply by making a large request that the respondent will most likely turn down. This technique achieves compliance as refusing a large request increases the likelihood of agreeing to a second, smaller request. Initially, you make a big request which a person can be expected to refuse. Then you make a smaller request which the person finds difficult to refuse, because they feel they should not always say no. For example, negotiating a pay rise with your boss. First, you make a request that will not be met and ask for 20% increase. When this is refused, you make a more realistic request and ask for 10% increase. Cialdini in 1975 asked participants if they would escort a group of young criminals to the zoo. Most refused. In control group, 2 participants were approached and asked to spend 2 hours per week as a peer counselor to young criminals for around 2 years. Again, most said no. However, in the experimental condition, participants were asked to be peer counselor and then the request was downgraded to escort children to the zoo. 50% agreed to the request. It has been found that door in the face technique produces high levels of compliance only when the same person makes the request and the requests are similar in nature. This technique works due to the principle of reciprocity. Cialdini et al. In 1975 mentioned this. Saying no to a large request may make the person feel they owe the other person who made the request a favor. The low ball technique. The low ball technique is a compliance method in which the persuader gets a person to commit to a low ball offer they have no intention of keeping. Then the price is suddenly increased. Since a person has already committed, it is hard to say no to the new higher price demand. For example, when buying a car, the salesman agrees a price, but must check with his manager if this is acceptable. While waiting, you think you have secured a good deal. The salesman returns and says, manager would not agree to the deal and the price is raised. Most people agree to the higher price. Cialdini in 1978 asked students whether they would participate in a psychology experiment that started at 7 a.m. and most participants refused in a control group. But in an experimental condition, Cialdini asked participants whether they would participate in a psychology experiment. And even though they were not told a time, most participants agreed. Later, they were told that it started at 7 a.m. and given the chance to drop out if they wanted. On the day of the experiment, 95% turned out. This success of this technique works on the principle of commitment because the person has said yes or agreed to an initial request. Commitment has been given. When the request changes or becomes unreasonable, the person will, to a certain degree, find it difficult to say no because of having originally committed themselves. That's it in this video. Stay tuned to